Hi guys, and welcome to Last Light Radio Channel. Tonight we step onto the American frontier in 1815, where the trees stand black against a pale sky, and the first sharp frost creeps over fields that still pretend to be generous. You wake to a world that looks almost beautiful, and that is the trick of it. The dawn glitters on fence rails. Your breath hangs in the air like smoke. The ground sparkles as if someone kindly dusted it with sugar. Yet every glittering blade of grass carries a warning. Every white crust on the pumpkin leaves says the same thing. You're running out of easy days. So, before you settle into the story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and tell me your location and local time down in the comments, because somewhere out there someone else is listening in the dark too. Now, dim the lights, and you stand in the thin morning cold of an American settlement, where surviving winter is less a plan than a contest between your hands and the season closing in. You rise before sunrise because autumn on the frontier is not a season for admiration. It is a deadline. The cabin air bites your nose the moment you push off the blanket. Fire in the hearth has collapsed into a faint red glow, and the floorboards feel hard and cruel beneath your feet. Nothing in this place likes to stay warm for long. Not your bread, not your fingers, not the small iron kettle by the ashes. Certainly not your optimism. Outside, the world waits in a hush that feels unusually polite. Birds chatter less. Insects have thinned out. The damp smell of earth is changing into something sharper, cleaner, and less forgiving. You step into grass that snaps under your boots. That sound alone can sour your mood before breakfast. Frost is a quiet kind of messenger, but it never arrives empty-handed. In 1815, much of the American frontier still means places where roads are mud tracks when they exist at all, where settlements are scattered, and where a family can disappear into the woods only a few miles from its nearest neighbour. You do not think of yourself as living in history. You think of yourself as living in a cabin that leaks smoke, where beans must be sorted by hand, and every scrap of cloth matters. Grand national events may drift eastward in newspapers weeks or months late, if they arrive at all. Out here, the real headline is simpler. Did the corn ripen? Did the pig fatten? Did the roof hold? This year carries its own uneasy shadow. The War of 1812 has only just ended, at least on paper, and not every frontier family feels far from danger yet. Some districts still remember raids, militia marches, and rumours that travelled faster than truth. Men who came home brought stories, old wounds, and sometimes very little money. Markets are uncertain. Travel is risky. A cold season following conflict feels harsher. Somehow, as if the world has already used up its kindness, you begin the day by looking at the sky. Frontier people become amateur prophets whether they want to or not. A red sunrise can provoke muttering. A ring around the moon may keep you awake. Wind direction matters. Cloud height matters. The behaviour of squirrels matters. Even the way geese lean south overhead can nudge your stomach into worry. Modern weather forecasts do not exist for you. There is only habit, memory, and the grim science of being wrong in dangerous ways. So you scan for signs. Is the air still? Is it too still? Does the creek run low? Have the walnuts dropped heavily this year? Some settlers swear that thick corn husks mean a hard winter. Others claim woollier caterpillars carry private meteorological wisdom in their striped little bodies. It sounds charming now. At the time, you would take advice from an insect if it improved your odds even slightly. Historians still argue whether folk weather signs truly guided practical decisions or simply gave people a language for fears they already held. Either way, the signs feel real to you because the risk is real. If winter comes early, any unfinished work becomes a threat with a name. Your cabin stands as proof that shelter and comfort are not the same species. From a distance, it looks sturdy enough. A small rectangle of logs crouched beside a clearing. A chimney of stone or mud and sticks. A door that hangs a little crooked. Perhaps a bit of greased paper in place of proper window glass, turning daylight into a weak yellow haze. It has the shape of safety. Step inside in January, though, and you may revise that opinion. For now, you are in the warning stage. The cabin has not yet become an icebox, but you can already feel where the cold will enter. Between logs, under the door, through the roof, where the patching was rushed in spring because there were always more urgent tasks. There are always more urgent tasks until the first hard frost makes them all urgent at once. Funny how that works. You move through the clearing, taking stock. The corn shocks stand like small armies in the field. Pumpkins lie squat and dull among curling vines. Squash must be gathered. Beans must be dried. Apples, if you're lucky enough to have trees, need storing. Turnips and potatoes should come out before the ground grows stubborn. A frontier autumn does not invite leisure. It announces inventory, and inventory can be unnerving. You count not just what you have, but what each thing might fail to become. Corn is not merely corn. It is meal, mush, johnny cake, hominy, and animal feed if you're fortunate. A pig is not merely a pig. It is winter meat, lard, soap, and a chance of surviving February without your thoughts turning uncomfortably toward the family dog. People joked darkly on the frontier because dark jokes were cheaper than panic. The smells of the season are strong and practical. Crushed corn stalks give off a sweet dry scent. Split pumpkins smell watery and green. Smoke from brush fires drifts low, mixing with damp leaves and distant manure. In the mornings, the air stings your chest. By afternoon, when the sun still has some warmth left in it, steam rises from your shirt as you work. This is one of the last pleasant deceptions of the year. Sweat can make you feel powerful in cool weather. Then the breeze touches your back, and suddenly nature is reminding you who really runs the schedule here. The frontier teaches you to notice sound in a very intimate way. The thunk of an axe is one kind of comfort. So is the cluck of chickens still producing eggs, though less reliably now. The squeal of a hog can mean future food, which is not pleasant to think about before breakfast. But there it is. More unsettling are the absences. Fewer birds in the hedges, less buzzing at dusk. A longer silence between gusts. The quiet gathers itself early in autumn, like someone pulling a heavy curtain. You are not alone in feeling tense. Animals read the season too. Cattle browse restlessly. Horses carry a thickening coat. Dogs curl tighter at night. Mice begin conducting bold little campaigns against your food stores. They arrive like accountants, nosing around every sack and corner. One quirky tidbit from frontier households is how often cats were valued not merely as pets, but as tiny armed guards with whiskers. A decent mouser could earn more affection than a lazy cousin. On the frontier, sentiment usually followed usefulness. Your hands are rarely clean, dirt works into the skin around your nails, corn silk clings to your sleeves, smoke settles in your hair, even water from the creek feels colder now, and washing becomes a brief act of bravery rather than refreshment. When you lift a bucket, the wooden handle presses hard into your palm. When you kneel to gather roots, the ground sends its chill straight through your stockings. Every touch tells you the same thing. Summer has stopped forgiving. Meals begin changing as well. Fresh produce is still around, but the mood of eating shifts from enjoyment to management. You dry apples if you have them. You shell beans. You rake herbs into bunches. You salt what can be salted. You think ahead in mouthfuls. That may be the simplest description of frontier life. You're always chewing on the future. There is a mainstream truth about early American settlement that gets lost beneath heroic paintings and schoolbook myths. Much of it was repetitive labour carried out under constant uncertainty, often by women and children as much as men. You do not stride nobly through every hour. You bend, you lift, you stir, you mend, you count, you worry. The romance of the frontier usually belongs to people who slept indoors and published books later. And yet there are moments of beauty that almost make you careless. Late afternoon light falls gold across stubble fields. Smoke lifts blue from the chimney. The woods flash red and copper. A flock of blackbirds ripples over harvested land like cloth shaken in the wind. You pause with an armful of kindling and think, against your better judgment, that this land can look gentle. The night falls faster than expected. The cold slips under your collar. Lesson learned. Inside the cabin, evening brings another layer of preparation. Corn must be shelled by hand. Clothing must be inspected. Blankets shaken. Tools brought in. A kettle might simmer with something plain but filling. Perhaps cornmeal mush. Perhaps beans with a scrap of pork if luck has smiled. Candlelight softens everything, which is helpful, because frontier interiors are not improved by scrutiny. Rough walls, smoke stains, the faint sourness of damp wool, the smell of ash never quite leaving. Comfort exists, but it is handmade and temporary. Conversation around the fire often circles practical matters. How much wood is stacked, whether the roof needs more attention, which neighbour may help with hog killing, whether the creek will freeze early, whether the nearest town has salt left. If someone recently travelled through, their news carries weight. Roads east washed out. Prices in market absurd. A family 3 ridges over already coughing. Such information drifts in, settles by the hearth, and becomes part of the household weather. Scholars still debate how isolated many frontier families truly were, because isolation varied wildly by region, wealth, and distance from river routes or towns. Some settlements were loosely connected through trade and church gatherings. Others were lonely in a more severe sense. From inside your cabin, though, the distinction hardly matters on a frosty night. A mile can feel like 10 when the path is dark and the wolves are rumoured nearby. Whether or not the rumours are fair to the wolves, you step outside once more before sleep. The stars are shockingly bright. Without city light, the sky feels larger than reason. It also feels colder. The moon silvers the clearing and turns the cabin roof pale. Smoke lifts straight upward, somewhere in the woods. A branch cracks. It could be deer. It could be nothing worth naming. Still, your shoulders tense. Frontier hearing becomes a strange art. You learn to classify sounds by threat, by distance, by the speed of your own pulse. There is another worry tucked beneath the obvious ones. Winter does not only test supplies, it tests timing. A family can work hard and still lose the race by a week. Corn can stay too wet. Meat can spoil if handled badly. A chimney can collapse in a January storm. An illness can take the strongest worker just when wood needs cutting most. Preparedness is never absolute. That is the frontier's least charming lesson. So on this first truly cold night, you do not feel dramatic. You feel alert. You feel the season narrowing its terms. The rough blanket scratches your chin. The mattress of straw or corn husks shifts beneath you with a dry whisper. Through the wall, the wind probes for openings. The fire settles with a soft collapse beside you. Someone breathes in sleep, or a child coughs once and quiets. Your own hands smell faintly of smoke and earth. This is how winter begins for you in 1815. Not with a famous blizzard, not with a cinematic disaster. It begins with warning, with glittering frost and long lists, with the taste of stored food already haunting fresh meals, with a cabin that looks smaller each evening, with the growing knowledge that every ordinary object around you, every sack of corn, every split log, every patched sleeve, is about to reveal its true value, and in the dark, before sleep finally takes you, one thought settles more heavily than the blanket. Cold is coming. Yes, but cold alone is never the real enemy. The real enemy is being almost ready. Morning arrives grey and mean, with a damp chill that slips through the cabin walls before you even open your eyes. The fire has gone low again. Of course it has. Fire on the frontier behaves like a needy child with a rude personality. Feed it constantly, and it still complains. Neglect it for a few hours, and it punishes everyone. You sit up under rough blankets and study the inside of your shelter as daylight seeps through the window opening. In weak light, every flaw becomes easier to notice. There is a thin seam between 2 logs where pale air creeps inward. There is a hairline crack near the chimney where yesterday's smoke traced a dark feather on the wall. The door hangs just unevenly enough to leave a narrow strip of brightness near the sill. That brightness might as well be a knife. In summer, such faults seem inconvenient. In winter, they become personal. This is the day for walls. Not elegant walls, not tidy walls, not anything a magazine would celebrate 2 centuries later with cheerful captions about rustic charm. Frontier walls are survival with splinters. You build, patch, smear, wedge, and brace until the cabin can hold back more cold than it invites inside. The first sensation of work is touch. Wood under your palm feels dry on the surface and damp beneath. The logs are ridged, rough, and stubborn. Your fingertips catch on fibres. Mud for chinking is cold enough to numb the skin almost at once. Straw mixed into it scratches your wrists. Clay clings to your nails and hardens in the creases of your hands. By noon, your knuckles look older than you are. Many frontier cabins in 1815 were simple log structures, often built quickly with whatever timber stood nearest the clearing. Settlers cut, notched, and stacked logs into square or rectangular houses, then filled gaps with a mixture called chinking and daubing. The chinking could be wood scraps, stones, moss, or sticks. The daubing might be mud, clay, lime, or a blend of materials depending on local soil and custom. It was practical building rather than polished carpentry. If the cabin stayed upright and reduced the wind to a manageable insult, people counted it a success. You start at the worst seam. Cold threads through it so steadily that a candle flame nearby would shiver. You press fresh packing into the gap with blunt fingers, then plaster over it with mud thickened by straw. The smell rises raw and earthen. Damp soil, wet grass, a little mould, a little riverbank. It is not pleasant, yet it carries its own comfort. Fresh daub means fewer drafts later. On the frontier, ugly can be very reassuring. Outside, the air smells of smoke, wet bark, and chopped wood. A pile of split logs waits beside the cabin, each piece carrying the clean, sharp scent of fresh sap. There is a bite to the breeze, but labour keeps your body hot. Your shirt clings at the shoulder blades. Your breath clouds when you pause. It is a strange rhythm, sweating in cold weather while preparing for colder weather. The frontier rarely offers a single clean misery. It prefers combinations. The roof needs attention too. Roofs are notorious optimists. They act sturdy right up until rainwater drips onto your blanket or snow sifts through in the night. Depending on means and location, a cabin roof might be made from clapboards, shingles, bark, or puncheons weighted with poles. None of those materials are immortal. Wind lifts them, rain swells them, time insults them daily. You climb carefully, feeling the boards cold and slightly slick under your boots, and inspect each weak place with the concentration of someone checking a wound. From above, the clearing looks exposed. Stumps rise from the earth like broken teeth. Beyond them, the woods crowd close, dark and watchful. The cabin itself seems almost laughably small against that backdrop. One little box of logs claiming a patch of America by stubbornness alone. It is difficult not to admire the nerve of it. It is also difficult not to question the judgment. You replace what you can, you wedge loose shingles, you tie down pieces likely to lift, you stuff vulnerable edges with whatever suitable material is at hand. Moss is useful, so are scraps of cloth in a pinch. Frontier households became masters of the phrase good enough for now, which sounds humble until you realize how much life depends on it. Historians still disagree about how quickly log cabins became symbols of independence, rather than what they really were for many families, which was transitional shelter born from necessity. Later generations romanticized them. Paintings and speeches turned the log cabin into a badge of Republican simplicity. From the roof, with wind in your ears and mud on your sleeves, it does not feel symbolic. It feels temporary, hungry for maintenance, and determined to humble any person who gets sentimental. The chimney demands inspection next. Ah, yes, the frontier chimney. That charming feature capable of keeping you alive or setting you ablaze. Many cabins used stick and mud chimneys, sometimes called cat and clay construction, especially where cut stone or brick was scarce. Wooden frames were plastered with clay, creating a flue that worked tolerably well until heat, weather, or neglect opened dangerous gaps. A proper stone chimney was safer, but not every household had the skill, labour, or materials, so you work with what exists and hope the smoke chooses upward. The base is checked first, loose stones are reset, crumbling clay is slapped back into place, soot stains your fingers black and greasy. When you lean close, the odour is thick and bitter, mixed with old ash and faint creosote. A frontier interior carries smoke in its skin. It settles into beams, blankets, clothes, and hair. Some visitors from more refined towns complained about the smell. Those visitors, one suspects, rarely had to decide between smoky air and freezing children. By midday, the light has turned whiter and thinner. The Isan hangs there mainly out of habit. You step back from the cabin and study it with a narrowed gaze. Practical people learn to look for places where shadow trembles, where light sneaks through, where the wall line sags ever so slightly. Shelter is not judged by charm. Shelter is judged by how little weather gets invited inside. There is also the matter of the floor. Some cabins had puncheon floors made from split logs hewn flat on one side. Others kept bare earth, at least for a time. Earth floors were cheaper and warmer in one sense, but they brought dampness, dirt, and a permanent relationship with dust when dry and mud when wet. Puncheon floors were an improvement, though rarely a luxurious one. The boards creak, splinter, and chill your feet just the same. You stoop to check for gaps or rot near the threshold. That is a favourite entry point for wind, mice, and discouragement. A quirky detail from frontier life is how often cabins included odd bits of improvisation that would puzzle later generations. A broken tool handle becomes a door brace. An old garment becomes insulation. Deer hide may cover a drafty opening. Paper, greased cloth, or scraped animal membrane can serve where glass is absent. The line between household object and building material is very thin out here. Everything may be called into service. Even a cracked bucket, useless for water, might still prove excellent for holding plaster. You carry armfuls of moss and straw, feeling their textures against your forearms. The moss is cool and springy. The straw is crisp, dusty, and inclined to poke. Each bundle has a dry, plant-like smell, somewhere between hayloft and ditchbank. As you pack them into narrow openings, the cabin seems to absorb the field and forest into its own body. Logs from trees, mud from earth, straw from harvest, smoke from wood. The house is not separate from the land. It is the land rearranged into a brief argument against exposure. Inside again. You test the room with your senses. The air feels a little stiller now. Not warm, exactly. Warm would be too generous a word. But the cabin holds itself differently. Sound changes in a tighter room. A cough no longer seems to drift toward every crack. The scrape of a stool across the floor sounds closer. Even the fire, once lit back up, speaks with more authority. A contained flame has a tone of success. You begin arranging the interior to serve the season ahead. Beds are shifted away from the draftiest wall. Extra blankets are folded where they can be reached at once. Cooking tools are placed with care. Corn sacks must stay dry. Powder, if there is any, must be protected. Candles or tallow dips are counted. Nothing in winter should require a frantic search at dusk. Frantic searches waste light, heat, and patience. The windows are their own little tragedy. Real glass existed, of course, but it was costly and scarce in many frontier districts. Some households had small panes. Others made do with oiled paper stretched over frames, greased cloth, shutters, or nothing more than a closed opening when weather forced the issue. Such substitutes let in some light while keeping out at least a part of the wind. They also turned the outside world into a blur. Trees became shadows. Sky became a pale stain. You lose beauty in exchange for endurance. There is a gentle claustrophobia to this kind of preparation. The more carefully you seal the cabin, the more you accept that months of life may compress into this limited space. One room, perhaps a loft, a hearth, a table, stools, beds, tools, clothing, food, and people. All of it breathing together, all of it smelling of smoke, damp wool, old wood, and suppers repeated too often. Privacy becomes a luxury for future centuries. Here, the wall that keeps out winter also keeps everyone in each other's company. Scholars continue to debate how much daily frontier building knowledge came from inherited European traditions versus local adaptation shaped by indigenous examples, regional materials, and plain trial and error. The answer is likely all of the above. Techniques moved with migrants. But the land forced revisions. A family from Pennsylvania could not simply command an Ohio forest or a Kentucky hillside to behave like home. Timber types changed. Soil changed. Weather habits changed. Pride changed too, after enough mistakes. By late afternoon your shoulders ache with a deep, steady heaviness. Mud has dried on your cuffs. Soot marks your cheek. The cabin door, newly braced and lined, closes with a more convincing thud. That sound satisfies you more than any speech. A good door sound can improve the spirit remarkably. Now comes a small ceremony of testing. You light the fire and watch where smoke draws. You stand near the walls with the back of your hand turned outward, sensing for cold currents. You hold still near the window and feel whether the air moves against your face. You listen. Cabins have a vocabulary. A whistle means one thing. A soft tick from cooling boards means another. A loose shutter chatters. A poorly packed seam sighs. Learn the language, and you may sleep better. As evening lowers, the hearth begins to colour the room amber. Firelight smooths rough logs into bands of honey and shadow. Steam rises from a pot, carrying the smell of cornmeal and something savoury. Perhaps pork fat if fortune has allowed some. The touch of warmth on your shins feels almost luxurious after a day outside. Your palms sting as circulation returns. Your clothes hold the chill in patches. Your hair smells of smoke and open air. This is the reward. Modest and honest. Not comfort in the grand sense. Not softness. Not ease. Simply a room that holds heat for a while and does not openly conspire against you. The patched walls look crude, but they no longer glitter with slivers of daylight. The chimney draws. The door shuts. The roof, as far as anyone can tell from indoors, remains loyal. You sit and let your body settle. The cabin creaks faintly as temperatures drop outside. Somewhere beyond the wall, a gust moves through naked branches with a dry, rushing whisper. The sound reaches you dimly now. That matters. A better sealed cabin changes not just the temperature but the psychology of night. Weather becomes an external thing again, not a housemate. Still, no one mistakes this for final victory. Frontier people learn caution from experience. Rain can undo good plaster. Frost can split what looked sound. Fire can turn careful work into panic within minutes. A cabin is never finished in the modern sense. It enters a cycle of perpetual defense. You repair, endure, observe, and repair again. Yet there is dignity in that labour. The American frontier in 1815 was built not merely by conquest or slogans, but by repetitive acts of maintenance. Hands pressing mud into gaps, hands lifting poles into place, hands blackened by chimney work. That truth is less glamorous than legend, but much more intimate. You do not survive because the wilderness admires your courage. You survive because you keep noticing what needs patching. Night fully settles. The single room draws inward around the fire. The smell of warm clay mingles with wood smoke and supper. You rest your sore hands near the flames and study the walls once more. They are uneven. They are rough. They are made from compromise, sweat, and local soil. They are, for tonight at least, enough. And on the frontier, enough is a beautiful word. By the time true cold begins prowling around the cabin each morning, your thoughts turn steadily toward food, not supper in the pleasant sense, not recipes passed around for delight. Food as arithmetic, food as insurance, food as the thing standing between your family and the slow, ugly weakness that winter brings when the pantry starts sounding hollow. You wake hungry because frontier work burns through a person quickly, even before dawn. The body seems to be asking rude questions. Is there enough meal left in the sack? How much pork remains in the barrel? Did the beans dry properly? Can the cow still be counted on for milk? Or has the cold and poor grazing reduced her generosity to a memory? It is amazing how loudly a stomach can think. Breakfast rarely arrives with ceremony. There may be cornmeal mush, thick and steaming, with a smell both plain and oddly comforting. There may be a heel of bread if flour has been saved or traded for. Sometimes there is a strip of salt pork, its scent rich enough to make the entire room feel briefly hopeful. Salted meat has a way of improving morale out of all proportion to its appearance. A small piece can scent the pot like a promise. Corn is your stubborn companion through much of frontier life. In 1815, on many parts of the American frontier, maize was not just common, it was central. It fed people, hogs, chickens, and hope itself. You grind it into meal, Boil it, bake it, fry it, pound it, stretch it into forms that would make a modern cookbook blink in concern. Whoosh. Pone, Johnny cake, hoe cake, hominy. Corn appears so often that you begin to suspect it has moved into the cabin as a full family member. The hand mill or mortar becomes part of the daily rhythm. Grinding grain is slow, shoulder-tiring work, and it fills the air with a dry, dusty scent that settles into your clothes. Fine meal clings to your skin. It powders the table. It drifts across the floor in faint, pale traces. When the grain is coarse, the food it makes feels rough on the tongue. When ground finer, it feels like luxury. Luxury, in this case, means your jaw suffers a little less. There is a quiet anxiety in every meal because each bowl eaten is one bowl gone. A full storehouse in autumn can begin looking alarmingly ordinary by midwinter. That is one of the frontier's sly tricks. At first the barrels seem impressive. The sacks look heavy. The shelves look crowded. Then weeks pass. Ladles dip. Knives cut. Mice nibble. And suddenly the abundance has developed edges. You check stored food constantly. Dried beans must remain dry. Meal must be protected from dampness and rats. Apples hung for drying need inspection. Pumpkins and squash go soft if bruised or neglected. Potatoes may rot in clusters, spoiling their neighbours like bad influences at a dance. Frontier storage requires vigilance rather than faith. You do not put away a crop and forget it. You manage it like a suspicious friendship. The smells of a food storage corner are strong and layered. Sweet dried apples, earthy potatoes, dusty meal, sharp cured meat, a hint of mould if something has gone wrong, wood smoke drifting over everything. In colder weather, the air preserves some things kindly and turns others hard as stones. An onion may keep, a loaf may toughen, a hunk of pork can shine pale in the low light, looking both glorious and faintly menacing. Hunting supplements the pantry, though the frontier never guarantees game merely because you need it badly. Deer may be taken when luck, skill, and season align. Rabbits appear more often. Squirrels, though small, were a serious source of meat in many regions, which is not quite the heroic image some people prefer. Yet hunger does not care for heroic scale. A pot with squirrel in it still smells encouraging. A pot without it smells like resignation. You step into the woods with a gun or traps and a mind sharpened by necessity. The cold air carries every sound cleanly. Dry leaves whisper underfoot. A branch taps another branch. Somewhere far off, crows scold with insulting confidence. Your fingers feel the stock of the firearm, cold and smooth in places, rough in others. Metal bites at ungloved skin. The smell outdoors is lean now. Bark, frost, damp leaves, distant water. It is a world stripped down to essentials, which sounds poetic until your stomach reminds you what one of those essentials is. A mainstream truth about frontier winter is that calories mattered more than culinary variety. People needed dense food to endure constant labour and cold exposure. Salt pork, cornmeal, beans, lard, and whatever game could be secured formed a diet that was repetitive but practical. This is the part where romantic frontier paintings usually go suspiciously quiet. No painter ever lingered lovingly over the sixth consecutive supper of nearly the same ingredients. Still, ingenuity appears in the pot. A handful of dried beans simmered long enough with pork fat can produce a meal that tastes richer than it has any right to. Cornmeal can be baked beside the fire into a cake with a browned crust and smoky edges. Pumpkin can sweeten a dish slightly if there is no sugar to spare. Wild nuts, gathered earlier and kept safe from mice, may be pounded and added for substance. You learn to admire small improvements. On the frontier, one onion is a mood enhancer. Some households kept bees if circumstances allowed, and honey could become a precious sweetener. Others tapped maples in season for sugar, but for many people, sweetness was rare enough to feel almost ceremonial. Children remembered it intensely. Adults probably did too, although they were less likely to admit it in a dignified tone. A quirky detail from the period is how often coffee and tea substitutes appeared when trade goods were scarce or costly. People brewed drinks from roasted grains, roots, herbs, or other local stand-ins that did the job. mainly if one defined job very loosely. Sassafras tea, for example, had a real place in household use. Roasted rye or corn might imitate coffee in the way a scarecrow imitates a gentleman. From a distance and with kindness, trading for food complicates the picture. Not every family lives entirely from its own land. Some bartered for flour, salt, or iron goods when possible. Salt especially mattered. It preserved meat, flavoured otherwise dreary meals, and occupied a place far more exalted than modern diners usually grant it. A shortage of salt could turn household planning sour in a hurry. Without it, the frontier table became even more honest than anyone wished. Historians still argue how self-sufficient most frontier households truly were, because memory and myth tend to exaggerate solitary independence. In reality, many families relied on a web of exchange involving neighbours, local mills, river transport, peddlers, and small market towns. Total isolation made for impressive legend, but practical survival usually involved trade, favours, and shared labour at key moments. You may feel ruggedly alone while chewing cornbread, but someone still had to make the iron kettle. Then there is the pig, that glorious, greedy investment on 4 legs. Frontier families valued hogs because they could forage, fatten well, and provide meat, fat, and useful scraps. Salt pork and bacon became staples precisely because pigs turned landscape and kitchen waste into future calories. There is nothing glamorous about hog management, but there is something deeply frontier about admiring an animal for its conversion rate into winter security. Lard deserves its own small hymn. It cooks food, enriches bread, extends lean ingredients, and appears in countless households as a quiet hero. A spoonful in a skillet can transform humble meal into something browned and crisp. It can also become soap with the right treatment. On the frontier, versatility is nearly as prized as quantity. People loved ingredients that knew how to multitask, yet the body keeps score when the diet narrows. By late winter, fresh greens are scarce, fruit is limited, and monotony settles in. Some families use sauerkraut or preserved vegetables when cultural habit and resources aligned. Others relied on wild greens as soon as the season allowed, but in the coldest months there can be a flatness to nourishment. Enough energy, perhaps, but not enough freshness. Mouths long for change. So do minds. You notice it in the way children ask what is for supper, as if hoping language itself might produce novelty. You notice it in the way adults stare into the pot before speaking. You notice it in the care given to tiny luxuries, a pinch of spice if any remains, molasses scraped from a crock, a piece of dried apple handed to a child. Even the smell of onions frying in fat can make the cabin seem briefly festive. The work surrounding food never really ends. Meat must be checked, water must be hauled, ashes must be managed for cooking, utensils cleaned, grain ground, crumbs guarded. Every meal has labour attached at both ends. There are no convenient packages, no preserved tins in common household use, no handy trip to a glowing store at dusk. Supper begins with wood and often ends with worry. At midday, you may eat standing up, still in work clothes, with cold air slipping through the door as someone enters carrying more fuel or a pail of water. The spoon is warm from the pot. The bowl is rough against your palms. Steam fogs your view for a second. For those few seconds, heat rises to your face and chest, and the cabin smells rich with broth or pork or baked meal. It feels nearly luxurious. Then the bowl empties much too soon. Frontier women often carried the larger burden of transforming raw stores into daily meals while managing children, laundry, sewing, dairying, gardening, and more besides. Men hunted, chopped, ploughed, repaired, and traded. But household food work was deeply shared or divided along lines that could become exhausting either way. No one on the frontier truly escaped labour by claiming that cooking was indoor work. Indoor work had a habit of being endless. There is also the matter of milk and butter. If a family had a cow, she could be a blessing, though winter feeding made her expensive in effort. Milk output often declined with season and condition. Butter required labour and cool handling. Cheese needed knowledge and luck. A cow was not a dairy aisle on hooves. She was demanding bargain with hay. In the evening, with the wind muttering at the walls, you may sit close to the fire and mend a sack while a pot simmers. The smell of beans softening in water is mild and earthy. The occasional burst from the hearth sends sparks upward. Grease hisses in iron. The room grows warmer near the flames and colder at your back. That contrast belongs to frontier life as surely as cornmeal does. One side of you cooks, the other remembers the weather. You think often about portions, not always aloud but inwardly, how much to serve now, how much to save, whether generosity tonight may become regret in February. This sort of calculation shapes the season. It can make people careful, tense, and sometimes quarrelsome. Hunger at a distance still has social effects. It sharpens tempers in advance. Scholarly debate lingers over exactly how often frontier families face severe seasonal hunger versus a more constant, modest insufficiency. The answer likely differed by region, harvest success, class, and timing. Some households endured true scarcity, others managed but without comfort. Survival existed on a range, not a single dramatic line. Yet even those who avoided famine often lived close enough to it to hear it breathing. That nearness changes the meaning of food. A crust is not trivial. Drippings in a pan are not waste. Bones go into broth. Scraps go to animals that may later feed you in return. Ash cake, baked in simple fashion among the coals, can count as a meal rather than a novelty. Appetite becomes practical, but never entirely joyless. People still savour what they can. They simply do so with less illusion. Night deepens. Spoons scrape the last from bowls. The air carries smoke, grease, and the faint sweetness of stored vegetables nearby. Your hands are rough from work, and the wooden spoon feels polished where generations of fingers might have held it, or where only your own have worn it smooth. The meal was plain, perhaps repetitive, perhaps missing what you wished for. Yet warmth moved through you while you ate. Strength returned to your limbs. The cabin quieted. On the American frontier in 1815 that counted for a great deal. You did not eat to be entertained. You ate to continue. You ate so your hands could lift tomorrow's wood. Your feet could cross frozen ground. Your mind could remain clear enough to judge weather and risk. A full belly, even briefly full, was never just comfort. It was capability. And in a land where winter asked hard questions every day, capability was one of the few answers you could taste. Soon enough, you learn that winter warmth does not begin in the hearth. It begins in the woodpile. Fire may look romantic once it is dancing in the cabin, casting amber light on rough walls and making soup steam in the kettle. Out in the yard, though, fire is still a mountain of labour waiting in the form of the logs, rounds, chips, bark, and splinters. Heat must be cut first, then hauled, then stacked, then guarded from dampness. Only after all that does it become cheerful. You step outside in the cold and face the day's most repetitive truth. The trees that surround your clearing are both your protection and your burden. They stand silent and abundant, and at first glance it seems almost absurd that any family could worry about fuel with so much timber nearby. Then the arithmetic begins. A cabin hearth eats wood with impressive greed. A cooking fire consumes more. A bitter spell can empty a neat stack faster than seems decent. Suddenly the forest looks less like endless supply and more like a giant account that must be withdrawn from by hand. The axe handle feels familiar in your palms now, polished in places by use and slightly rough where sweat and weather have raised the grain. It is cold when you first grip it. Very cold. The iron head dulls the warmth from your fingers in an instant. When you swing, the shock travels up your arms into your shoulders and back. Woodcutting is not elegant work. It is impact, breath, rhythm, and fatigue. Chop, lift, strike, pause, listen to the tree answer. There is a sound a green log makes, and a different sound from seasoned wood. Frontier ears learn those differences. A hard, satisfying crack can encourage you. A dull thud can ruin your mood. The smell matters too. Fresh split oak releases a deep, rich scent. Hickory smells sharp and strong. Pine gives off resin, almost sweet. Each tree offers a different promise in the stove or hearth. Hardwoods last longer and make steadier coals. Softwoods catch quickly, flame fast, and disappear with insulting speed. Good kindling flatters the fire. Poor fuel merely apologises for itself. In 1815, no frontier family treated firewood as an afterthought. It was one of the central labours of the cold season. Wood heated the cabin, cooked the meals, warmed washwater, dried clothing, and sometimes kept illness from turning worse. A lack of good fuel could make everything else harder. Without sufficient wood, food took longer to prepare, nights felt crueler, and dampness lingered in bedding and clothes. Even a well-stocked pantry loses some comfort if the room itself bites your skin. You choose trees or fallen timber with care, if care is possible. Dead standing trees can be valuable because their wood is often drier than fresh-cut logs. Downed timber may be half-rotted, wet, or full of insects. Some trunks split cleanly. Others seem to resent the tool and your existence together. Frontier labour teaches you that not all wood is equal, not all trees are convenient, and not all days feel fit for this nonsense. Still, the pile must grow. There is a raw honesty in the work. Your breath comes hard. Frost smokes from your mouth. Your boots sink in leaves or frozen mud. Chips fly and land against your trousers. The scent of bark and damp earth rises around each blow. Sometimes the woods fall quiet between strikes. So quiet that the next sound of metal biting wood feels almost rude. Then a raven calls overhead, or a squirrel scolds you from a branch as if you were the one behaving badly. A mainstream fact of frontier life is that fuel consumption was enormous compared with modern indoor living. Open hearths were inefficient by later standards. Much of the heat went up the chimney, and cabins often lost warmth through imperfect walls, roofs, and doors. People compensated not with advanced insulation or thermostats, but with relentless labour and adaptation. They burned more, wore more, huddled more, and accepted discomfort as part of the arrangement. Nobody on the frontier asked whether the house felt cosy in a decorative sense. They asked whether enough wood was stacked to reach spring. Felling a tree is one task. Turning it into usable fuel is another. Once down, the trunk must be limbed, sectioned, split, and hauled. Each stage introduces fresh opportunities for strain. Limbs whip unexpectedly. Bark tears your gloves, if you're fortunate enough to have gloves. Frozen ground jars your knees when you kneel to work. When a round finally breaks apart under the maul or wedges, the exposed grain looks pale and clean inside, almost too beautiful for something destined to vanish as smoke. Children often helped with fuel work in frontier households, though according to age and strength, they gathered twigs, carried chips, stacked smaller pieces, and learned very early that kindling was not trivial. A fire rarely fails because there is no large log nearby. It fails because there is nothing dry and small to persuade the first flame. This gave rise to one of the least glamorous but most necessary household habits: saving scraps, bark strips, splinters, broken bits from chopping. Nothing burnable was ignored without reason. There is a quirky side to firewood culture too. People could become oddly opinionated about tree species, seasoning methods, stacking styles, and the best way to revive a sluggish hearth. A family might argue over whether certain wood smoked too much, sparked too dangerously, or burned too quickly. Another household swore by keeping a stash of extra dry pieces under shelter for bitter mornings. Practical debate had the flavour of doctrine. When your comfort depends on combustion, you develop convictions. Historians still argue over how accurately later memoirs described frontier wood shortages, because memory often dramatised hardship while also smoothing away the daily monotony that produced it. Some regions had abundant timber near at hand. Others faced local scarcity as settlements expanded and nearby trees disappeared. Weather, terrain, and labour supply changed everything. Yet even in wooded country, abundance did not mean ease. Trees do not walk to the door and politely season themselves. Hauling wood becomes its own punishment. An armload looks manageable until you bend and gather it. Then the pieces shift. Bark scrapes your wrists. One log slips and bruises your shin. Another leaves your shoulder smelling strongly of sap. The weight presses awkwardly against your chest, making each step careful and slightly ridiculous. In snow or slush, the walk from chopping site to cabin stretches longer than reason. You make trip after trip anyway. because no one has invented a better answer than persistence. Some families use sleds, carts, or drags when roads, animals, and circumstances allowed. Oxen or horses could make the task less punishing. Though feeding them through winter was a heavy matter in itself, not every household possessed such help. Plenty of wood simply moved by human back and arm, one load at a time. This is one of the frontier's recurring themes. The body is the first machine available, and it gets used thoroughly. Stacking wood sounds easy until you do enough of it. Then you understand that a bad stack is an invitation to waste. Wood must dry. It must stay as sheltered as possible from rain and snow. It must be accessible in darkness, wind, and deep cold when nobody wishes to be outside longer than required. A good stack feels almost architectural. A small wall of future warmth built with care. Pieces laid too loosely topple. Pieces laid carelessly trap moisture. Pieces left on bare ground absorb dampness and sulk. You run your hand over a finished row and feel the different textures. Rough bark, smooth split faces, damp outer chill, dry inner grain. The stack smells like a whole stand of trees compressed beside the cabin. There is comfort in that smell. It smells like foresight. Inside the cabin, wood reveals its value one stick at a time. A small fire for dawn must be coaxed into life by pale hands that do not fully trust the morning. You kneel by the hearth, feeling old ash soft under the poker and brick or packed earth cold beneath your knees. A coal revived from the night before can feel like a miracle. When dry kindling catches, it snaps with a light eager sound. Then the first larger pieces begin to take. Smoke rises, flames settle, and the air changes almost at once. Not warm, not yet, but hopeful. Touch becomes a measure of success. Hands held near the fire sting as feeling returns. Damp stockings begin to steam faintly. A kettle placed near the flame grows warm on its sides. Iron tools lying too near the heat become almost too hot to handle, while your back remains cold enough to remind you not to grow smug. Frontier heating is uneven in the most personal way. Your face may glow while your shoulders complain. One cheek lives in July, the other remains loyal to January. Cooking multiplies the demand for fuel. Boiling beans, baking bread, frying fat, heating broth. All of it spends the pile. The cabin smells of smoke and sap, with sharper notes when pine or other resinous wood burns. Some wood spits sparks, some settles into dense coals that make a steady red bed for long cooking. Experienced households learn to match task to fuel. Quick flame for one thing, long heat for another. Fire management becomes part craft, part instinct, part annoyed improvisation. Night is when the woodpile enters your thoughts most insistently. Darkness beyond the cabin turns the world into a black wall, and suddenly every log indoors seems precious. You count in your head without meaning to. How many days at this rate? How many mornings before that outer stack looks thin? Whether that last storm forced you to burn more than planned, whether the weather will turn savage next week. Wood is not just fuel, it is time made visible. This anxiety is not irrational. Severe cold could be deadly even without dramatic disaster. A weak fire meant poor sleep, colder bodies, slower drying, and harder mornings. Sick people suffered more in chill rooms. Children did too. Elderly settlers, when present in a household, faced particular danger. Even emotional strain sharpened in cold. Patience shortens when your fingers ache and the room never quite reaches comfort. Scholars continue to debate how often frontier families slept with fires maintained through the night versus banked low and rebuilt at dawn. The answer likely depended on fuel supply, safety concerns, cabin design, and habit. Leaving a strong fire overnight risked sparks and chimney accidents. Letting it die meant waking to hard cold and a battle for first light. Many households banked embers under ash in hopes of coaxing them back by morning. Success on that front could feel like being favoured by Providence. A curious detail of the era is how much ash itself mattered. Wood ash was not mere waste. It could be used in making lye for soap, for cleaning, and sometimes for other household tasks. The frontier habit of using everything extended right into the fireplace remains. A split log gave heat, light, coals, and ash, each useful in its own way. Even after the flame died, the wood kept contributing. More considerate than some neighbours, perhaps. By late winter, the routine of fuel work wears into the body. Shoulders knot, palms harden. Backs ache with a steady, dull complaint. Snow around the chopping area becomes littered with chips and stained with bark. The path between woodpile and door is trampled flat and familiar. You can walk it half asleep, carrying an armload in the dark, guided by habit and the faint glow from the cabin window or doorway. And still the work continues. That is the frontier truth hidden behind every pleasant fireside image. A hearth is lovely, only because someone kept feeding it at great inconvenience. Every warm bowl of mush, every thawed mitten, every dry blanket, every quiet evening by the flames came from repeated effort outside in cold air with an axe or a bundle in hand. Comfort was chopped from the forest a little at a time. At last you close the cabin door against the night and lay another log on the fire. The room brightens. Smoke and resin scent the air. The wood catches with a low roar, then settles to a steady crackle. Light moves across the log walls and over your sore hands, making the cuts and grime look almost golden. The pile outside may still worry you. The season may still feel long. Yet for this moment, the fire holds. And because it holds, so do you. Darkness arrives early now, with a kind of confidence that feels almost insulting. The light fades before your work feels finished, before the animals are fully settled, before the last bucket is drawn, before your hands are ready to stop. Afternoon narrows into dusk, and dusk drops straight into night as if the sun has simply lost interest in your survival. You stand in the yard for a moment, watching the final grey wash drain from the sky, and you feel the frontier's loneliest truth. Winter is not only cold, it is long, dim, and terribly quiet. Inside the cabin, evening does not bring brightness so much as a smaller darkness. Firelight helps, of course. So do candles, if you have them, or tallow dips, if you have made them. Yet none of these defeat the night. They merely carve out a little island within it. Beyond that circle of flame, the corners of the room stay soft and shadowed. The rafters vanish into gloom. Tools on the wall look stranger than they did by day. A hanging coat resembles a person until you look properly. The imagination, it turns out, does not need much encouragement. You trim a wick, light a taper, and watch the room gather itself around the small yellow glow. The smell of tallow is thick and slightly sour, familiar but never pleasant. Beeswax candles, when they can be had, burn sweeter and cleaner, though many frontier homes could not spare such elegance for daily use. More often the light is smoky, flickering, and unreliable. It bends at draughts you thought you had stopped. It gutters when the door opens. It leans and trembles as if it shares your uncertainty. This was one of the less celebrated hardships of frontier life in 1815. Artificial light was costly in labour and material, and winter consumed it rapidly. Candles did not appear by magic in a drawer. Tallow had to be rendered, wicks prepared, moulds or dipping managed. Oil lamps, where used, depended on supplies that might not be easy to replace. Every hour of evening light had a price attached. People learned to count tasks against flame. Sewing, mending, reading, tool repair, quiet conversation, which deserved the candle, which could wait until dawn. The touch of night is different from the touch of day. Daylight, however cold, keeps the world visible and therefore somewhat negotiable. At night, the cabin walls feel closer, the air by the door seems colder. Floorboards chill your feet with sharper intention. Blankets scratch more. Wood smoke hangs lower in the room. If you step outside, the darkness touches your face like damp cloth and makes the yard feel larger than it really is. Familiar things alter after sunset. The well becomes a black opening. The woodpile becomes a crouched shape. The tree line becomes a wall. Sound grows larger in darkness. A pop from the fire can make you start if your thoughts are far away. Wind rubbing branches together outside creates a dry, whispering complaint that seems almost conversational. A shutter if one is loose. can produce a repetitive tapping that turns from mild annoyance into personal grievance over the course of an hour. Somewhere beyond the clearing, an owl calls. Farther off, perhaps, a fox barks with that eerie, human-like sharpness that never quite sounds decent. Dogs hear things first and react with low growls or sudden barking that stiffens every spine in the room. The frontier after dark was not always objectively full of danger, but it often felt full of possibility, and that was enough. Wild animals, wandering strangers, weather shifts, chimney sparks, sick children, labour waiting at dawn, all of it seemed to gather at the edge of the lamplight. Even when nothing happened, the sense that something might happen was its own form of company. You begin to understand why people valued routine at night. Routine keeps the mind from wandering down unhelpful paths. Supper dishes are scraped and set aside. Embers are managed. Water is placed within reach. Clothing is arranged to dry where it will not scorch. Tools are brought in from the yard. Doorbar checked. Hearth checked. Bedding shaken. These small acts create a structure against uncertainty. They tell the night that the household is not entirely at its mercy. The smell inside the cabin deepens after sunset. Warm wood smoke, cooling ashes, damp wool steaming faintly by the hearth, cooked beans or corn lingering in the pot, old leather, tallow, and the clean mineral scent of water in a wooden bucket. It is a lived-in smell, thick with necessity. To an outsider it might seem heavy. To you it becomes a kind of assurance. A room that smells of use feels occupied, defended, held together. Some evenings are quiet in a good way. Someone mends clothing by candlelight, needle glinting briefly with each careful movement. Someone else scrapes a tool handle smoother with a knife. A child grows drowsy on a stool near the fire. Voices stay low because low voices match the room. There may be a story, a remembered joke, a bit of scripture read aloud if the light can be spared, and the reader's eyes are strong enough. The frontier was not without tenderness. It simply had to fit that tenderness into cramped quarters and uncertain fuel. A mainstream historical fact often overlooked is how much winter evenings compressed family life into one shared space. Many frontier cabins were small, and the hearth was the centre of both heat and activity. This meant work, rest, illness, childcare, and conversation happened in close company. Privacy was scarce. Solitude, in the modern sense, hardly existed. A person's thoughts had to make their own corners. That closeness could comfort and irritate in equal measure. A child restless with boredom can seem much louder in one room than in a wider house. A cough repeated through the evening becomes impossible to ignore. A tired adult with sore shoulders may not feel naturally poetic about shared warmth after the third spilled bowl or the fifth request for another story. Winter pressed people together. Human nature supplied the friction. Still, boredom itself was a real challenge. Long nights did not automatically produce peace or reflection. They could produce impatience, melancholy, and a strange heaviness of spirit. When darkness settles before the body feels ready to rest, the mind may become restless inside its own limits. Some people carved wood, some braided straw or patched harness, some talked, some simply stared at the flames and let thought drift. There is no reason to believe the frontier produced only brave, cheerful souls. It produced tired ones too. Historians still debate how common serious loneliness was among frontier settlers, because letters and memoirs often mixed gratitude, pride, and hardship in uneven ways. Some households lived close enough to kin or neighbours for regular visits. Others were truly remote, especially in bad weather. Much depended on region, roads, rivers, and season. Yet many accounts agree on one point. Winter magnified distance. A short trip by daylight in fair weather became something else entirely after dark and in snow. That distance is easiest to feel when someone is missing. A family member away trading or visiting kin. A neighbour expected but not arrived. A traveller overdue on the road. Darkness makes absence heavier. The mind begins inventing reasons. Bad trail, swollen creek, injured horse, broken wagon, a fall, a storm. The frontier gives imagination too many useful materials. The scholarly uncertainty extends to the emotional world of the frontier itself. Researchers can recover inventories, letters, travel accounts, court records, and church notes. But the full inner life of ordinary winter evenings often slips away. How afraid were people, truly, when wolves sounded near? How often did they lie awake listening to the wind and counting worries? How much did silence itself wear on them? We can infer some things. We cannot hear every thought that stayed unspoken by the fire. One curious detail of household life is how strongly superstition could persist alongside practical skill. A family might know perfectly well how to bank a fire, cure meat, and patch a roof, yet still read omens into sounds and signs at night. A dog howling strangely, a bird striking near the house, a candle burning unevenly, in hard settings. People did not always divide the world neatly between reason and superstition. They used whatever language made uncertainty feel less shapeless. Outside the cabin, the night world continues its own business. Snow or frost brightens the ground when there is moonlight, making the yard glow faintly while the woods remain black. On moonless nights, the darkness can feel nearly solid. Your boots crunch sharply on frozen ground if you step out to fetch more wood or check an animal. The cold smells metallic and clean, with a trace of smoke from your own chimney, and perhaps another family's chimney drifting from far off, if the air lies right. That distant smoke can be strangely moving. It proves that someone else is awake in the dark, tending flame, tending worry, tending life. Animal sounds carry farther in winter air. Horses shifting in the stable, a cow stamping, chickens unsettled by some minor disturbance, mice moving inside the walls or under the floor with scandalous confidence. Even the settling of the cabin itself becomes part of the nightly orchestra. Logs tick softly as they cool. A beam creaks. Ash collapses in the hearth with a faint sigh. Houses on the frontier do not sleep silently. They murmur. Then there are the nights of weather, wind rising with force enough to make the chimney pull differently, sleet hissing against the roof, snow tapping the wall in soft dry bursts. Those sounds can be soothing at first, almost lulling. Then the mind remembers what weather can do. Snow means drifts at the door, trouble for livestock, harder travel, more fuel burned. Wind means drafts newly found, roof strain, branches down. You lie under blankets listening, judging by sound alone whether this is merely weather or a message. A child waking, frightened by the dark, changes the whole room's atmosphere. A feverish person coughing through the evening changes it more. Night magnifies discomfort because there are fewer distractions. By daylight there are tasks to answer worry. After dark there is mostly endurance. You stir the fire, offer water, adjust blankets, speak softly, wait. The waiting is its own labour. And yet, not every long night is miserable. Sometimes the fire burns steadily. The candle behaves. Outside sounds stay distant and ordinary. The work of the day is done as well as it can be. There is bread enough for morning, wood enough for another day. No one is coughing. In that rare balance, the darkness becomes protective rather than oppressive. It seals the cabin away from demands for a few hours. The world outside may be vast and cold, but it cannot enter unless you open the door. That is the frontier's strange gift. The same darkness that frightens you can also simplify things. It reduces life to immediate essentials: flame, shelter, food, voices, breath, warmth shared within reach. The rest of the continent may as well dissolve beyond the tree line. Eventually, the candle shortens, tallow pools, shadows thicken again, bedding is spread or climbed into, straw rustles, blankets are pulled close, the last visible coals settle into a lower red glow. In that dimness, faces become outlines and then disappear. Only sound remains, a shifting sleeper, a final cough, wind outside, the little brittle crack of burning wood. You lie awake for a while, eyes open to the dark you can no longer see through. The cabin smells of smoke and wool and the last warmth of bodies near the fire. The blanket is coarse against your chin, One foot is warm, the other less so, the kind of injustice frontier life specializes in. But the room holds, the door stays shut, the fire still lives, and in a winter full of deep black miles, a small room with one steady glow is enough to keep the night from winning. Clothing becomes your second shelter, and sometimes your first. Before you even think about stepping outdoors, you think about layers. Not fashionable layers, of course, nothing so cheerful. Frontier winter dressing is a negotiation between what you own, what still fits, what is not torn beyond repair, and what can be trusted to stay between your skin and the cold for one more day. The body wakes stiff, and the garments waiting nearby feel chilly to the touch, as if they spent the night developing opinions about your comfort. You begin with linen if you have it, the underlayer that keeps wool from scratching you raw quite so quickly. Linen has a dry, cool feel when first pulled on. In winter dawn it can be an unfriendly sensation, like wrapping yourself in a cold thought. Over that comes wool. Blessed, prickly wool, heavy enough to matter and stubborn enough to keep insulating even when a little damp. That quality alone made it precious. Wool was not soft in the modern sense. It was useful, which on the frontier was a much deeper compliment. A shirt, stockings, petticoats or trousers, perhaps a waistcoat, perhaps a short gown or jacket, depending on who you are and what the household owns. Then the outer layer, a coat if there is one, a shawl, a cloak, a cap, mittens, perhaps. Clothing in 1815 on the American frontier varied by region, wealth, heritage, and trade access, but no household possessed endless options. Garments were mended, altered, patched, handed down, turned inside out, cut down for children, and patched again. Fabric had more than one life because it had to. The smell of winter clothing is its own frontier atmosphere. Clean linen is rare enough to be noticed. More commonly, you get wood smoke woven into everything, lanolin lingering in wool, damp leather from boots drying too slowly by the fire, and the faint sourness of sweat earned honestly through labour. Nothing about this is glamorous, yet there is reassurance in it. Clothes that smell of smoke are clothes that have stood near the hearth. Clothes that smell of the outdoors have at least been useful. You pull stockings over skin that still remembers the warmth of blankets. The wool catches slightly at the heel and ankle. It is rough, but better rough than numb. Shoes or boots come next, and here the frontier really starts showing its sense of humour. Good footwear is priceless. Good footwear is also hard to maintain, expensive to replace, and easy to ruin. Leather stiffens in the cold. Soles wear thin. Seams fail. Moisture creeps in. The entire winter can feel like a long campaign to keep feet from becoming a personal tragedy. A mainstream fact of frontier survival is that cold injuries often began with simple dampness. Wet feet, soaked hems, snow packed around ankles, gloves too thin, sleeves not quite long enough. You did not need a dramatic blizzard for winter to do damage. You needed repeated exposure, a little neglect, and poor drying conditions. Frostbite and dangerous chilling were not everyday inevitabilities for everyone, but the risk was real enough that clothing choices mattered constantly. Warmth was never just about having garments. It was about keeping them dry, layered, and in decent repair. That last part takes work. Mending fills many evening hours. A shirt cuff frays, a seam opens along the shoulder, a stocking wears thin at the toe, a coat loses a button or tie. Needle and thread become winter tools as vital as axe and kettle. You sit close to the candle or hearth, squinting at fabric worn soft by use. Fingers, already rough from daily labour, must suddenly perform finer labour. The thread drags through cloth with a tiny resistant pull. The patched place never looks elegant, but elegance has no vote here. Women often bore the heavier share of making, maintaining, washing, and altering clothing, though everyone felt the consequences of failure. Spinning, weaving, cutting, sewing, knitting, and patching could consume astonishing amounts of time. Even households that bought some textiles still needed the skill to keep garments alive. The frontier did not reward vanity much, but it rewarded competence and cloth. There is a tactile education in winter dress that city life can easily forget. You know by touch which wool blanket still traps heat and which has thinned too much. You know which pair of mittens lets wind through at the fingers. You know the difference between leather that only needs grease and leather that is one bad day from giving up entirely. A child learns quickly that snow on a shoe is not charming for long. It melts, then it soaks, then the cold enters properly. Historians still argue over how much homespun cloth actually dominated frontier wardrobes by 1815, because trade textiles had penetrated many regions more than legend suggests. Imported or mill-made fabrics were available through markets and merchants in some areas, while other households remained more reliant on home production. The famous image of every frontier family dressed almost entirely in homespun is probably too neat. Reality was patchier, which somehow feels appropriate. A linen shirt from trade, a homespun petticoat, a deerskin pair of leggings, a wool shawl bartered from somewhere else. The wardrobe, like the country, was assembled unevenly. Deerskin and other hides appear often in frontier imagination, and not without reason. Leather garments and moccasins could be supple and practical, particularly in some regions and circumstances, though they wore differently from woven cloth and demanded their own maintenance. Buckskin leggings, hunting shirts, or moccasins might serve well for certain work and travel. They also carried smells of tanning, smoke, and weather that no one could mistake for refinement. When a hide gets wet, it tells the whole room. A quirky frontier detail is how much improvisation could enter a single outfit. A coat might have one sleeve pieced from a different cloth. A cap might be lined with fur from one animal and patched with fabric from an old petticoat. Mittens might not match. Buttons could be bone, wood, metal, thread loops, or simple ties. A garment was judged by whether it functioned, not whether it formed an ensemble. The frontier would have done very poorly at modern fashion week and rather well at surviving sleet. Head coverings matter more than vanity ever could. Caps, kerchiefs, hats, hoods, and shawls help keep in precious warmth. You feel the difference immediately when ears are covered and the back of the neck is protected from wind. Cold against the ears has a particularly cruel clarity. It seems to sharpen every other discomfort. A wool cap pulled low can feel like salvation. A missing cap can spoil the morning before breakfast. Hands are another ongoing argument with the season. Mittens are warmer than gloves in many cases because fingers share heat, but mittens also make tasks clumsy. Gloves offer dexterity if you have them, yet they may be thin or worn through at the tips. Many frontier tasks still force bare fingers into cold air. You cannot always split kindling, tie cord, thread a needle, or handle tiny household tasks while wrapped like a gentleman on a sleigh ride. The hand comes out into the cold, does the work, then throbs as warmth creeps back. This cycle repeats so often that it begins to feel ordinary, though it never feels pleasant. Boot drying becomes almost ceremonial. At day's end, footwear is placed near enough to the fire to warm and dry, but not so near that leather cracks or shrinks. That distance is learned by experience, and usually by at least one regrettable mistake. Damp boots smell sharply animal and earthy when heated. Steam rises faintly. The leather darkens, then lightens again as it dries. You watch them with concern because tomorrow may depend on whether they remain wearable. A ruined boot on the frontier is not just inconvenience. It is exposure with laces. Children make winter clothing more complicated because they grow. They wear things hard, and they possess an astonishing ability to become wet almost immediately. Sleeves creep short, shoes pinch, stockings vanish into impossible places. Small garments are constantly being adjusted, remade, or handed from one child to another. A frontier household with children is therefore also a small textile crisis in permanent motion. Scholars continue to debate how people subjectively experienced cold in pre-modern clothing, since adaptation, habit, workload, housing, diet, and expectation all shaped perception. Someone raised in such conditions may have judged a winter day differently than a modern person would. Still, adaptation has limits. We should not romanticize endurance into immunity. People suffered the cold. They simply possessed fewer alternatives and perhaps fewer illusions about that fact. Washing clothes in winter presents its own unkind joke. Water is colder, drying takes longer, soap is labour, hands chap and crack. Linen freezes stiff if mishandled. Wool can shrink or felt. Yet garments near the skin still need attention, because filth and dampness can produce discomfort and illness of their own. Frontier households navigated this with a mix of necessity, compromise, and grim acceptance that not everything could be washed as often as one might wish. Freshness, like privacy, belonged to better-housed centuries. The sensory life of the layered clothing is constant. A wool skirt brushes the shin with rough warmth. A coat pulls at the shoulders. A kerchief traps heat and the smell of your own breath. Snow melts on the hem and leaves the edge heavy. Cold air sneaks through sleeve openings when you reach upward. Damp stockings chill the ankles. Then, after labour begins, the layers warm against your body and the whole arrangement starts to feel almost bearable. This is frontier luxury. Not softness, not beauty, just bearable. You learn tricks. Stuffing extra cloth at the chest, wrapping feet in scraps if stockings fail, greasing leather, drying mittens by the fire and turning them often, shaking frost from a cloak before bringing it inside, keeping one better set of garments, if possible, for Sundays or special visits, though even that better set may be only slightly less patched than the rest. Care itself becomes a resource. Households that watched their clothing closely could stretch usefulness much longer than careless ones. There is also social meaning in clothing, even on the frontier. A visibly ragged family might be judged as poor, unlucky, or negligent, sometimes unfairly. A well-kept shawl or decent broadcloth coat could signal access to trade and status. Yet winter is an honest critic. Fine fabric that does not warm is less admired when the wind rises. Practical dress carried its own authority. The person in the plain wool wrap and sturdy boots often had the better idea. By evening, after a day outdoors, your layers hold the whole story of your labour. Smoke at the cuffs, mud at the hem, cold trapped in the outer cloth, warmth lingering in the inner. When you peel off a damp glove or loosen a boot, the relief is immediate and vivid. Skin prickles, feet ache back to life. The fire's heat reaches places the day forgot. A shawl hung to dry releases the scent of weather into the room. The cabin fills with steaming cloth, leather, and the faint musk of wool. It smells like endurance. You spread garments where they can recover before morning. Not too close to the flame. Not too far. The right balance again. Everything on the frontier seems to depend on the right balances found through trial, error, and stubborn memory. And as the night deepens, you understand one thing very clearly. In winter on the American frontier, clothing is never just what you wear. It is what stands between your living body and a season that would rather test you one chilled inch at a time. By the heart of winter, you understand that distance is not measured only in miles. It is measured in weather, in mud, in darkness, in the state of a horse, in the depth of a creek, in the strength left in your legs after a week of labour. A neighbour may live only 2 or 3 miles away and still feel as remote as another country. Once snow settles into the ruts and the wind starts speaking in that thin, unpleasant voice through the trees. The frontier teaches you a hard little lesson. Independence sounds noble in daylight. Need sounds truer at dusk. You like to think of your household as capable. Most people do. Pride comes naturally when you have built, planted, cut, patched, hauled, and endured with your own hands. Pride helps you rise in the dark and face another day of work that would make softer lives sit down immediately and complain to a magistrate. Yet winter has a way of exposing the limits of solitary confidence. A sick cow cannot always be managed by one person. A roof beam too heavy to lift does not care how determined you feel. A difficult birth, a broken axle, a chimney fire, a fever, a missing child in snow. These things do not politely wait until you have enough help within your own walls. So you begin to measure your world by people as much as by timber or corn. Which family keeps a lantern burning late? Which man owns a team strong enough to drag a stuck sled? Which woman knows more about herbs, infants, coughs, and practical mercy than the nearest physician many miles away? Which boy can run a message fast? Which old settler has seen enough winters to smell trouble coming before the sky admits it? On the frontier, usefulness is a form of social grace. A visit in winter is never casual in quite the modern way. Even a short call requires planning. You pull on extra layers, check the light, judge the sky. Consider whether the path through the trees is packed enough to trust. If there is snow, each footstep announces itself with a crunch or a muffled squeak depending on the cold. If there is thaw, the mud grasps at your boots with swampy determination. If there is ice beneath a dusting of powder, the earth performs one of its meaner tricks and invites humiliation. You feel every yard of the journey through your ankles and knees, and yet, people go. They go because loneliness weighs more heavily indoors after too many grey days. They go because news matters, because a woman near her time may need watchful company, because a pig has been butchered and there is meat to share or trade, because someone heard coughing from a cabin near the creek and wants to know how serious it sounds, because the minister may not come, the doctor may be far, and the road may be rude, but human beings still need to see one another's faces in winter. The sounds of approach become recognisable long before a visitor appears. A dog barks differently for a stranger, a neighbour, and a fox, or so every household believes. Hoofbeats on frozen ground carry in a clear, hard rhythm. A sled runner whispers or scrapes depending on the surface. Voices outside in cold air seem sharper, as though the weather has honed them. Then comes the knock, or sometimes just the opening of the door with a burst of white air and the smell of wool, horse, leather, and snow. That smell alone can lift the room. A mainstream truth about frontier communities is that they depended on mutual aid far more than later mythology sometimes admitted. The image of the wholly self-sufficient settler has always been a little theatrical. In practice, families borrowed tools, traded labour, shared seed, helped raise buildings, watched one another's children, and answered emergencies whenever distance and weather allowed. Survival rested not only on individual grit, but on networks of obligation, kinship, barter, and plain decency. The frontier could be lonely, but it was rarely livable as a one-family performance. Inside the cabin, a visitor changes the atmosphere at once. Snow shakes from coats, boots stamp at the threshold. Gloves are pulled off with stiff fingers and held toward the fire. Steam begins to rise from wool and leather, carrying that damp animal smell that every winter household knows. New voices stir the room. News follows them in. Prices in town. Rumours about a trader delayed on the river. Word that a mare foaled badly. Word that a child recovered. Word that a road west is nearly impassable. The cabin grows warmer not just from another body, but from information itself. You pour something hot if there is anything to pour. Coffee if luck and trade have been kind. More likely some substitute brew, or simply hot water flavoured with what the house can spare. Food appears in modest form. Cornbread, salt pork, dried apples, a spoonful of beans. Even thin hospitality matters because hospitality on the frontier is partly practical insurance. Turn a traveller away too coldly, and you may one day feel that coldness returned when your own need comes knocking. This does not mean everyone is equally generous. Frontier communities contain the full range of human temper. There is the neighbour who appears before being asked and brings exactly what is useful. There is the one who arrives mainly to collect gossip and consume your best chair. There is the chronic borrower whose sense of repayment remains suspiciously poetic. There is the family so private that asking them for anything feels like requesting a kidney. Winter reveals character with unusual clarity. Shared hardship can make people kinder. It can also make them meaner. A quirky feature of rural life is how some households become known for one special competence. One man is excellent with broken bones in livestock. Another can mend a wagon wheel in weather that would freeze complaint in your mouth. One woman can cut and fit garments so cleverly that fabric seems to stretch beyond its nature. Another keeps bees somehow, against reason and season. A certain elderly widow might know enough about fever teas and poultices to be spoken of almost like a local saint. Titles are not always formal on the frontier. Reputation does the naming. Historians still argue over how cohesive frontier communities really were, because the answer varied wildly by region, ethnicity, religion, wealth, and local conflict. Some settlements developed deep systems of reciprocity and shared labour. Others were fractured by suspicion. land disputes, political tension, or simple temperament. Memory often polished a rough social world into a charming little brotherhood of cabins. But reality could be thornier. People helped one another, yes, though often with calculations humming underneath. Who owes whom? Who failed to show up at the last raising? Who repays in pork and who repays in excuses? Still, when weather turns dangerous, petty grievances often lose some of their appetite. A family caught short on food may receive cornmeal from the very man they argued with over a fence line. A labourer with a broken hand may find assistance from a household that has every reason to stay home. Winter enforces perspective. You can dislike someone and still hand them kindling if the alternative is foolishly cruel. Travel for help remains a serious undertaking. If someone falls ill at night, a rider may set out with lantern and horse through dark woods, listening to hooves strike frozen ruts and trying not to imagine every shadow as a stump, ditch, or broken branch ready to end the journey badly. The cold gets into the face first, then the wrists, then the feet if the ride is long. Breath from the horse steams thickly. Leather reins grow stiff. The stars seem indifferent and absurdly bright. Distance in such moments feels almost moral, as if the country itself is testing how badly you want assistance. You also learn that help is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is simply a woman appearing at the door with broth, or a boy carrying a sack of meal, or two men standing in your yard at first light because they heard your axe had broken and there is wood to cut. Such acts lack the drama of rescue scenes, but they preserve far more life over the course of a winter. Civilization on the frontier often looks like somebody arriving with an extra pair of hands. The emotional texture of neighborhood ties is complicated. You may depend on people you would not choose for close companionship in gentler circumstances. The man who talks too much may still be the best person to fetch when a horse goes lame. The woman who judges every household within 10 miles may also be the one you want at difficult birth. Need refines social priorities with brutal efficiency. Charm is pleasant. Competence is beloved. Religion and gathering also bind people when weather permits. A Sabbath meeting in a home, a shared meal, a quilting bee, a corn husking earlier in the year, a communal butchering day. All these events carry more than practical value. They keep people from becoming only labouring units in separate cabins. They remind each household that others are enduring the same season, breathing the same cold air, muttering at the same muddy boots. Song sounds different in winter. It lifts harder against the walls. There is a physical relief in company. Another person by the hearth means another set of observations, another memory, another opinion about weather, crops, and the mysterious behaviour of pigs. Laughter, when it happens, feels almost medicinal. Even gentle sarcasm improves the room. A frontier winter produces many opportunities for dry humour, because if you cannot mock the mud, the frozen bucket, the self-important rooster, and the man whose boots split at the exact wrong moment, then the season begins to feel unbearably solemn. Scholars continue to debate how much frontier neighbourliness should be understood as voluntary generosity versus economic necessity. The honest answer is likely both. People were not saints floating through the snow with casseroles and beatific expressions. They knew that help given could become help received. Reciprocal aid formed a practical system. Yet calculation does not cancel kindness. In hard places, the two often travel together. A borrowed shovel may come with gossip. A shared meal may carry silent expectations. Human warmth is still warmth. Children experience neighbourhood life differently. For them, another cabin can feel like novelty and liberation. More voices, different food, a dog to chase, cousins or playmates, a chance to hear stories not told in their own house, snowball games or sledding on a rough hill if weather and adults allow. Even in difficult times, children find absurd reasons to laugh. That may be one of the frontier's most stubborn mercies. Joy persists where logic says it should have packed up and moved east. Of course, distance can fail you. A storm may make visits impossible. A swollen creek may cut one household off from another. Illness may pass silently because no one can safely come. The nearest neighbour can be kind and still unreachable. This is where the frontier's harsh geometry shows itself. Community matters deeply, but geography retains a veto. So each visit becomes precious in ways more settled societies may overlook. The sound of another voice in the doorway, the exchange of small goods, the quiet certainty that someone knows your circumstances. To be known in winter is a form of shelter. It eases the mind even when it does not lighten the work. At the close of day, after a neighbour has gone and the door is barred again, their absence lingers strangely in the room. A stool pulled closer to the fire, a few wet tracks drying on the floor, the faint smell of snow and horse still mixed with smoke. Perhaps a borrowed item waiting by the wall to be returned. Perhaps a promise made. If the weather holds, someone will come help with the hog. If the cough worsens, send for us. If your lantern goes dark, ours will be in the window. These are not grand declarations. They are better than that. They're usable. And on the American frontier in winter, usable kindness may be the richest kind there is. You settle by the hearth and listen to the cabin's small noises. The room feels enclosed again, but not quite as solitary. Somewhere beyond the dark trees are other fires, other kettles, other tired hands unlacing boots, other people measuring weather and worry exactly as you do. The miles between you remain real. So does the cold. So does the risk. But so does the knowledge that when necessity presses hard enough, somebody may still come through the snow. Illness feels different in winter because the whole season seems ready to help it along. A cough sounds sharper in cold air. Fever feels more alarming when the room itself can barely stay warm. Even a small weakness becomes troublesome when water must still be hauled, wood must still be carried, and clothing must still be dried by the fire. On the frontier, sickness rarely arrives alone. It brings inconvenience, fear, extra labour, and the unwelcome question of who can afford to rest. You notice the first signs quietly. A child stays dull-eyed by the hearth instead of fidgeting. An adult clears the throat once too often. Someone complains that the light hurts their head. A hand on a forehead lingers there a little longer than usual. These small moments are how winter worry begins. Not with a grand medical announcement, with ordinary behaviour shifting just enough to tighten the room. The cabin air does not help. It is thick with wood smoke, stale breath, damp wool, and the sharp scent of tallow. Windows, if they exist in any useful sense, stay as closed as possible against the cold. Fresh air enters grudgingly. Heat must be saved, yet closed rooms can feel heavy, especially when several people sleep, work, and recover in the same space. The smell of sickness joins everything else. Warm skin, sour bedding, herb steam, broth, ash. It is a household scent no one mistakes. In 1815, frontier medicine was a mixture of home remedies, traditional knowledge, folk practice, local experience, and, when available, the attention of a physician whose training might be uneven by modern standards. Doctors existed, certainly, but not every family could reach one quickly, pay one easily, or trust that one would arrive before the illness changed shape. Much of care, therefore, happened within the home. Women especially carried the burden of nursing, preparing food, making poultices, washing cloths, soothing children, and watching symptoms through the night. The work could be relentless. A mainstream historical fact is that winter respiratory complaints were common and dangerous in the early 19th century. Colds, influenza-like illnesses, pneumonia, bronchitis, and other chest problems could worsen rapidly in cold, smoky, crowded spaces. What sounds minor at dawn could sound frightening by midnight. Add poor nutrition, exhaustion, and exposure, and the body has less reserve than anyone would like. Even healthy people lived closer to serious decline than modern households often realize. So you begin with what the house knows. Warmth first. If warmth can be managed, blankets pulled close, more fuel on the fire, a kettle on to make something hot, broth if meat can be spared, cornmeal mush softened with milk if there is milk, tea from herbs gathered in better seasons, mint, sage, horehound, sassafras, boneset in some places, onion syrups, honey if fortunate enough to have it, vinegar mixtures, steam from hot water, and cloths laid against chest or brow. None of this guarantees much. Still, doing nothing feels impossible. Touch governs so much of care. You feel the heat of a forehead with the back of your hand. You smooth damp hair from a temple. You rub cold fingers to bring them back. You wring out a cloth and lay it gently across skin that seems too warm one moment and too chilled the next. The body becomes something watched closely and translated imperfectly. A dry tongue, a rattling breath, a flushed cheek, a skin that feels suddenly clammy. These signs matter because there are few instruments to speak more clearly. The sound of illness changes a cabin. A persistent cough cuts through conversation and through sleep. Shallow breathing makes everyone listen harder. A child whimpering in fever can strip calm from the room more quickly than any winter gust at the door. Even ordinary noises begin to arrange themselves around the sick bed. Spoons stir more quietly. Boots are set down with care. Voices drop. Firewood is carried in with less clatter. When one body suffers, the whole household starts moving to its rhythm. There is also the awkward problem of labour. A sick person cannot always be spared from work for long, and the people nursing them still have their own tasks waiting. Water needs hauling whether or not someone has a fever. Animals do not postpone hunger because a household is anxious. Bread must still be mixed, wood still chopped, ashes still cleared. This is one of the frontier's crueler habits. It allows very little pause. Care and labour overlap until both feel exhausting. Historians still argue over how effective many frontier remedies actually were beyond comfort. Hydration, warmth, and rest. Some treatments surely soothed and occasionally helped. Others may have done little or even caused harm. Bleeding, purging, and certain strong compounds formed part of medical practice in the period, even though modern readers often shudder at them. Home nursing might preserve a patient more kindly than heroic intervention, or it might delay needed help. Outcomes depended on the illness, the season, the knowledge in the room, and luck, that old frontier physician who never sends a bill yet charges heavily. A peculiar detail of early American medical life is how common household remedy books and inherited recipes could be. Even in places where printed material was scarce, advice travelled by mothers, grandmothers, neighbours, itinerant healers, preachers, and sheer repetition. One family trusted goose grease on the chest, another swore by onion poultices. Someone else preferred mustard plasters, hot bricks wrapped in cloth for the feet, or vinegar steeped with herbs. The frontier did not lack opinions, it lacked certainty. When symptoms deepen, worry becomes physical, your stomach tightens, your shoulders refuse to loosen even when you sit. Candlelight seems too dim for the task of judging another person's face. Night stretches longer because every cough wakes you. The mattress rustles when you rise again to add wood, lift a cup, or check a blanket. There is a raw intimacy to nursing by firelight. The room smells of damp cloth, smoke, broth, and tiredness. Outside, the wind may be moving through the trees exactly as always, but it begins to sound indifferent in a new way. If the patient worsens, someone may have to fetch help. That decision carries its own fear. How bad is bad enough? Is the nearest doctor worth the distance? Or will a skilled neighbour arrive sooner and prove more useful? Can the horse manage the trail at night? Will the creek crossing hold? Every choice has weight because every choice costs time, effort, and exposure. Frontier decision-making rarely offers a perfect option. It offers the least risky imperfect one. The ride for help, if it happens, feels endless. Frost stings the face. Rains bite cold into the hands. Breath from horse and rider mingles in white bursts. Hooves strike frozen ground with hollow, hard sounds that seem much louder at night. Trees crowd close on the path. The smell is all winter and animal. Leather, cold air, manure, smoke drifting faintly from distant cabins, and the dark, wet scent of creek banks. Fear sharpens every sound. You keep listening for the next bend, the next milestone, the next sign of a light where someone can answer. A doctor, when he comes, may bring a saddlebag, authority, and very mixed prospects. Frontier physicians could be dedicated men working under severe limitations, but access to formal training varied widely in the early Republic. A doctor's arrival might reassure a family simply because someone else now shares responsibility. He may examine the pulse, inspect the tongue, ask about chills, bowel changes, pain, appetite, and sleep. He may prescribe rest, broths, herbs, bleeding, blistering, calomel, laudanum, or some combination that reflects the medicine of the day more than the medicine of comfort. The family hopes and obeys as best it can. Scholars continue to debate how frontier families understood disease causation in ordinary life. Ideas about humours, miasmas, cold exposure, contagion, constitution, and divine providence often overlapped rather than replacing one another neatly. A person could believe bad air was harmful, cold feet dangerous, and God's will active all at once. This was not unusual confusion so much as the medical reality available to them. The language of illness was broad because the causes felt broad. Children's sickness carries its own dread. Their bodies seem to burn and chill more quickly, and their fear pierces the room in a sharper way. A child may ask for water, for mother, for the light to stay on, for impossible comfort. The spoon touches small lips. A tiny hand grips your finger with surprising strength, and then with less. Every parent in every century knows something of this helpless watchfulness. But on the frontier, the surrounding conditions make it feel even harsher. There is no quick journey to a bright clinic, only the cabin, the fire, the blanket, the basin, the prayer. Older people face winter illness differently. A cough settles deeper. Recovery takes longer. A fall on ice can steal confidence even if it spares the bones. Appetite weakens, sleep fragments. The frontier was never especially gentle with age. Respect might be offered, but ease rarely was. An elderly person who could no longer contribute much labour still required fuel, food, and care, which could strain a household while deepening its tenderness. Hard places often reveal affection most clearly in the work people perform for one another. Not all sickness is fever and chest trouble. Frozen skin, aching joints, tooth pain, stomach complaints from bad food or water, injuries from tools, and weakness from poor diet all thread through the season. Chapped hands can split and bleed, eyes smart from smoke, back seize after lifting wood. A small cut can turn troublesome when washing and rest are inadequate. Winter gathers these miseries and gives them time to linger. Yet the cabin also becomes a place of small recoveries. A fever breaks and leaves bedding damp but hope renewed. A cough loosens after days of steam and broth. A child asks for food again. Someone who lay still all afternoon sits up by evening and asks what chores were missed. That last question, while irritating on the face of it, is usually a very encouraging sign. On the frontier, renewed interest in work can count as a medical victory. The sensory details of recovery are humble and vivid. The first swallow of broth that stays down, the warmth of a cup against cold hands, the smell of bread becoming desirable again, fresh straw under bedding, a washed face, a window opened a crack for cleaner air just briefly, while the fire pulls strongly, sunlight touching the blankets at midday. Health returns not with trumpets, but with appetite, colour, and complaint. There are losses too, and winter households know that. People did die of illnesses that now might be treated more effectively. I will keep this gentle, because the frontier itself supplies enough weight without extra darkness. It is enough to say that many families lived with a painful awareness that some fevers turned, some lungs failed, and some nights did not end as hoped. This awareness shaped how people watched one another and how fiercely they valued ordinary wellness. That is perhaps the strangest thing about sickness on the frontier. It makes even plain health feel luxurious. A good appetite, warm hands, deep sleep, a chest that breathes easily in cold morning air. These are not background blessings here. They are active forms of wealth. By the fire, with a kettle murmuring and the room smelling of herbs and smoke, you keep your watch. The night grows late. Someone dozes. Someone stirs. The log shifts in the hearth with a shower of sparks. You lift a cup, adjust a blanket, lay a hand gently against a brow once more. Outside, winter goes on with its usual hard calm. Inside, care answers it in softer tones. And sometimes, on the American frontier, soft persistence was the strongest medicine a household could offer. There comes a point in winter when preparation stops feeling impressive and starts feeling fragile. The woodpile is no longer a proud stack but a visible countdown. The meal sack, once heavy enough to reassure, now folds in on itself more easily when lifted. The roof that held through earlier storms suddenly seems too thin for the sky above it. This is the season's grimmest talent. It does not always defeat you with one dramatic blow. Often it simply keeps returning until every object in the cabin looks slightly less certain than it did before. A storm begins long before the first snow reaches your yard. You feel it in the air. The morning light comes weak and flat, as if rubbed with ash. Wind shifts, and then goes oddly still. Animals behave with that irritating talent they have for noticing trouble before you can name it. The horse stamps and tosses its head. Chickens settle uneasily. Even the dog seems too alert. Nose lifted, ears working. The smell outside changes as well. The cold becomes sharper, cleaner, almost metallic. And there is a strange emptiness in the air that makes you uneasy. You go through the practical motions because that is what people do when weather threatens. More wood brought close to the door, water filled, loose things secured, animals checked, fire built up, the latch tested again, because apparently you believe the latch becomes stronger each time you frown at it. Bread or mush prepared early while the hearth is steady, candles counted, blankets shaken out. Every small precaution feels useful and also absurdly small compared with the sky's intentions. The first flakes may arrive gently, with almost insulting softness. They drift down between bare branches and settle on the yard as if the weather has come in a mild and decorative mood. Then the wind finds them. Snow begins to travel sideways, then upward, then in circles, abandoning all respectable behaviour. The world outside the door blurs. The tree line fades. Fences disappear a rail at a time. The cabin, never large, suddenly becomes the entire known universe. A mainstream truth about frontier winter is that storms were dangerous not merely because of cold, but because they disrupted every other system at once. Travel stopped, fuel use increased, livestock needed more care, water access became harder, visibility failed, roofs leaked or sagged, drifts blocked doors. A family already managing close to the edge could be pushed into real crisis by only a few bad days. The storm did not need to be legendary. It only needed to arrive at the wrong time. Inside, the cabin's sounds change under weather. Wind presses against the walls with a long, hollow force, then shrieks briefly at some crack or corner as if offended by human shelter. Snow rattles dryly against shutters or roof edges. The chimney draws harder, then oddly, then sends a little smoke back into the room just to remind you who is truly in charge. Fire pops. A beam creaks. Now and then the whole cabin seems to listen, holding its rough breath. Touch becomes immediate and instructive, near the hearth. Your shins feel almost too warm. Turn slightly, and the cold at your back remains sharp enough to keep you humble. The packed earth or puncheon floor chills through stockings. Damp wool takes forever to dry. Hands sting after carrying in armloads of snow-dusted wood. If you open the door even briefly, wind claws through the room and steals warmth with astonishing confidence. The latch slams. Everyone in the cabin looks offended, as if the weather has committed a social crime. Stormlight has its own bleak beauty. By day, the window covering glows a pale, sour white. It brightens the room without truly cheering it. Faces look tired in that light. Wooden bowls look barer. Smoke seems bluer. At dusk, the white outside darkens into a blur that erases distance entirely. You cannot judge how deep the drifts are at the shed or whether the path to the animals still exists under the new fall. You only know the storm is still there, busy with its own plans. There is often no choice but to go outside anyway. Animals still need feed and water. A door may need clearing. A loose board may be threatening the roof edge. This is where winter stops being scenery and becomes a bodily argument. You wrap up, pull the cap lower, brace yourself, and step into air that feels almost solid with cold. Snow needles exposed skin. Wind takes your breath with rude efficiency. It gets into the eyes, the sleeves, the space between scarf and chin. Your boots sink deeper than expected. Every few steps, you lean forward and keep moving because standing still is just the storm's way of negotiating surrender. The smell outside during heavy snow is faint and strange. Less earth, less wood. mostly cold itself, mixed with the sharper scent of animal shelter, hay, and your own chimney smoke when the gusts carry it back low across the yard. A stable or shed smells warm by comparison, dense with manure, damp hide, and fodder. Even that smell can become comforting when the weather is trying to sand your face off. Historians still argue over how often dramatic frontier snow disasters entered memory compared with the slower, more common attrition of ordinary storms. Memoirs and local histories love a blizzard because it makes a better story. Yet many households were worn down less by one famous event than by repeated smaller blows. 2 days of sleet, a week of bitter wind, another thaw that turned to ice, a roof leak, a lame horse, a spoiled sack of meal. Hardship often accumulates quietly, which can make it feel even more unfair. Then comes the matter of loss, and winter has many ways to arrange it without becoming theatrical. A calf may fail after a cold night. Chickens may stop laying or die in a sudden freeze. A barrel may sour. Flour may run lower than reckoned. A tool may snap when the iron is brittle with cold and no replacement lies nearby. A sled runner may crack. A roof seam may open. None of these alone ruins a family. The trouble is that winter rarely stops at one. You begin to understand why frontier people measured wealth in durability as much as in money. A strong horse, a sound roof, a good axe, a heavy kettle, a thick blanket, a decent pair of boots, a healthy sow. These were not just possessions, they were reserve strength. When one failed, the whole household felt a drop in confidence. The emotional effect of losing a useful thing in winter can be surprisingly sharp. It is not grief in the grandest sense, yet it has a sting all its own because necessity was attached to it. A quirky detail of rural weather lore is how people named storms by effect rather than scientific classification. The big drifting storm, the crusting snow, the sleet that broke the orchard, the wind that took the shed roof. Such names sound plain, but they carry useful memory. They tell you what weather did, not merely what it was. On the frontier, that distinction makes sense. Nobody needs a poetic label for the storm if what they really need is to remember which one killed the cabbage and stranded the wagon. Inside the cabin, tempers can shorten under weather's pressure. Close quarters, poor sleep, extra labour, and uncertainty make even decent people brittle. A child whining too long, a pot boiling over, wet mittens hung too near the fire, someone forgetting to latch properly. None of these is serious, yet under storm conditions, each can attract irritation far beyond its natural size. This does not make frontier families unusually cruel. It makes them human in a room that feels smaller every hour. Still, endurance has its own rituals. You check the fire, stir the pot, count the candles again, brush snow from a coat and hang it up. Clear the door once more before it drifts shut in earnest. Lift a child closer to the warmth. Tell a story, perhaps, or repeat some bit of local humour so dry it could be burned for fuel. Little acts matter because they slow the mind's tendency to race ahead into catastrophe. Practical motion is often the best companion to fear. Scholars continue to debate how settlers understood risk from weather in relation to providence, planning, and sheer luck. Many people certainly read storms through religious language. Others emphasize skill and preparation. Most likely they did both. A family might pray sincerely for mercy while also reinforcing the shed, banking the fire and cursing the broken shovel. Human beings rarely choose only one explanation when the roof is rattling and the meal is low. When the storm finally eases, the silence afterward can be almost shocking. Wind drops. Snow no longer ticks against the wall. The world outside the door stands white, deep, and strangely innocent, as if it had not just spent the last day trying to make your life difficult. Drifts lean against fences, branches bow. The path to the woodpile has vanished. The sky may clear so suddenly that blue appears overhead with indecent cheerfulness. Then comes the reckoning. You step out into snow that groans or squeaks underfoot, depending on the cold. The air bites, but it feels calmer now, more readable. You inspect everything: roofline, animal shelter, chimney, wood stack, tracks, frozen water buckets. Any sign of weakness or damage, there is always something: a loosened board, A drift blocking the door to the shed, a chicken gone missing, a section of fence down. Perhaps only minor trouble, perhaps not. But winter always leaves a note after visiting. Sometimes the reckoning includes harder news from beyond your own yard. A neighbour's roof partly gone, a cow dead, someone stranded and only now arrived, someone ill from exposure after attempting travel in bad conditions. Information moves slowly after storms, and each scrap of news carries weight. You listen with the grave attention frontier people gave to all reports of weather and survival. Another family's trouble never feels entirely separate from your own, because next time the line between their yard and yours may be only luck, loss also reaches inward. After enough difficult weather, people themselves grow worn, shoulders stoop, voices flatten, sleep becomes lighter, worry settles in the face. Even those who remain healthy and supplied can feel a dull fatigue of spirit. Winter strips variety from life and replaces it with watchfulness. That mental strain leaves marks no less real for being less visible than frostbite. And yet, this is where endurance becomes something more than stubbornness. You rise anyway, clear the path anyway, mend the fence anyway, feed the animals, stretch the meal, relight the fire, shake out the blankets, laugh once when someone slips in the yard but is not hurt, then feel guilty for laughing and laugh again because guilt cannot compete with relief. The frontier does not usually reward dramatic heroics. It rewards repeated recovery. That may be the least glamorous and most honest fact of all. Survival in winter often looks like resuming chores after disappointment, not triumph with banners, not some glowing speech by the hearth, just a pair of tired hands picking up the next necessary thing. By evening, the cabin smells of wet wool, smoke, and thawing snow. Boots sit near the fire rimmed with damp. A shovel leans by the door. Someone has cleared enough of the path to reach the woodpile again. Supper is plain, but it is hot. The room is weary, yet functioning. Outside, the snow reflects moonlight with that cold brightness winter likes to wear after behaving badly. Inside, the fire settles into coals, steady and red. You look around at the patched walls, the shrinking stores, the drying clothes, the people who are still here, and you understand something difficult and plain. Winter on the American frontier is not impressed by your plans. It does not care how hard you worked in October or how carefully you counted in November. It will take what openings it can find, but if you can keep answering each blow with one more day's labour, one more repaired thing, one more meal, one more cleared path, then the season does not get the final word. At some point, almost without permission, winter begins to loosen its grip. Not kindly, not all at once. The frontier does not suddenly turn soft and apologetic. It simply starts offering small betrayals of the cold. Water drips from the roof edge at noon. Snow around the doorway sinks inward and turns grey. The path to the woodpile, once hard and white, develops patches of dark earth that smell rich and wet when your boots disturb them. You notice these changes with suspicion first. Winter has fooled you before. A mild afternoon can still be followed by a night sharp enough to punish optimism. Yet the signs continue. Morning frost no longer sits as heavily on the fence rails. The creek speaks more boldly under its crusted edges. Air moving through the trees carries less iron and more mud. That smell alone can work strange effects on the spirit. Damp ground, rotting leaves, cold water. It is not a sweet smell. Exactly. It is a waking smell, a loosening smell. The land begins to give off the scent of itself again rather than the clean blankness of frozen months. You still rise to chores in the same rough cabin. The fire still needs tending. Stores still need careful counting. Boots still need drying. But your body senses a shift before your thoughts fully trust it. The cold no longer presses with the same constant authority. There are moments, brief but real, when your shoulders drop and stay there. You stand outside with a bucket in hand and realize you're hearing birds again. Not many, just enough to sound almost reckless. A mainstream fact of frontier life is that late winter and early spring were often nearly as difficult as the coldest months, sometimes worse in practical ways. Food stores ran thin, roads dissolved into mud, Livestock came through the season weakened. Sickness could linger. Frozen ground softened into ruts and sucking clay. Still, the promise of thaw mattered deeply because it changed what hardship meant. Winter asked mainly for endurance. The coming season, however muddy and inconvenient, offered movement, planting, and the possibility of rebuilding strength. You step through the yard and feel the ground underfoot turning unreliable. Snow lingers in shaded places, crusted and dirty. In sunlit patches, the earth gives way slightly under your boots with a wet, unpleasant squelch. The frontier's sense of humour remains intact. After months of frozen severity, it rewards your patience with mud up to the ankle. Charming. Truly. The animals notice before anyone announces it. Chickens scratch more eagerly in exposed spots. Horses toss their heads differently, alert to softer air and new smells. A cow's hide carries the barnyard warmth of living muscle rather than the shrunken reserve of deep winter. Even the dog seems less offended by the yard. There is more to sniff, more to inspect, more to bark at with complete confidence and limited understanding. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere shifts as well. Blankets are aired when possible. Dampness rises in a different way now, not from constant deep cold, but from thawed boots, dripping eaves, and muddy hems. The room smells of smoke as always, but also of wet wool, softening leather, and earth beginning to travel indoors on every foot. Winter's clean severity gives way to a more cluttered discomfort. Yet nobody mistakes this for a worse bargain. Mud is troublesome. Yes. Mud also means the frozen hold is breaking. Historians still argue over how settlers emotionally experience the end of winter, because sources often describe practical tasks more clearly than inner relief. Yet it is hard to imagine that the first true signs of spring passed without effect. After months of counting wood, mending clothing, nursing coughs, and measuring distance in cold miles, even small changes in light and sound must have felt profound. A blackbird on a fence, water running, a softer wind at dusk. Hope on the frontier rarely arrived with speeches. It arrived in details. There is work waiting. Of course, there is always work waiting. Repairs postponed in bitter weather now come due. Fence rails must be checked. Garden ground considered. Tools inspected. Seed measured. The cabin, having carried you through the winter, looks tired in the new light. Mud chinking needs attention. Smoke stains seem darker. The roof wants another look. But the sight of these flaws no longer strikes quite the same dread. In deeper winter, every needed repair feels like a threat. Near thaw, a needed repair feels like a task with a future attached. A curious frontier truth is how quickly people could return to planning once survival seemed slightly less immediate. Human beings are impressive that way. Yesterday you were worrying over the last stores of meal. Today you're already arguing about planting depth and whether the North Patch should be used differently this year. The mind turns toward growth as soon as it dares. Children often show the seasons change most honestly. They drift toward the door more often. They notice puddles as if puddles were a gift from heaven. They bring in wet shoes, muddy hems, and entirely unreasonable levels of excitement over small birds. Adults try to remain measured, because adults know late frosts can still insult everyone involved. But even adults listen longer when geese pass overhead, or pause when the breeze carries the first unmistakable softness. Food tastes different when the end of scarcity feels imaginable. The same mush, the same bread, the same bit of pork may still be plain, but it no longer seems trapped in endless repetition. You begin to think of greens that will come, milk that may increase, eggs more regular, gardens beginning again. The body leans toward what is not yet here. Appetite and hope are old companions. Scholars continue to debate the balance between resilience and suffering in frontier memory. Later generations often glorified endurance until it sounded clean and noble. The reality was rougher. Winter wearied people. It frightened them, strained them, narrowed their comforts, and sometimes took more than a family could spare. Yet resilience was real too, just rarely theatrical. It lived in patched walls, saved drippings, shared labour, banked coals, dried mittens, late-night nursing, and the decision to rise once more when there was no audience at all. By now, The light lasts a little longer each evening. That simple fact changes the mind. Tasks do not feel so cornered. The cabin breathes more easily. The fire still matters, but it no longer seems the single keeper of life. You may stand outside at sunset, mud on your boots and smoke in your clothes, and watch the sky hold colour a while longer over the trees. Gold near the horizon, blue above, water somewhere running unseen, a bird giving one last call. The whole frontier, so harsh and tight in January, begins to open its hand, and you feel it in yourself too. Fatigue remains, yes, so do caution and memory. But under them is a quieter thing. Relief. Not loud relief. Not triumphant relief. Just the easing of a knot you had almost forgotten was there. Now, as the fire settles lower and the cabin grows calm around you, you let that relief spread slowly through the room. The walls that held against the wind stand quiet in the softer dark. The blankets feel a little lighter. The air carries smoke, damp earth, and the faint promise of rain instead of snow. Outside, the last cold patches rest in the shadows, but the ground beneath them is waking. You do not need to hurry. You have already done the hard part, one day at a time, one chore at a time, one long night at a time. The frontier lies hushed around you now, not empty, not threatening, just resting between seasons. Somewhere water moves beneath the earth. Somewhere buds wait on dark branches. Somewhere the fields are gathering themselves for another year. So you let your eyes grow heavy. You let the crackle of the hearth soften into a distant murmur. You let the cabin, the woods, the thawing ground, and the deep American sky drift together into one quiet picture. Winter has not been gentle, but it is passing. The cold is easing as the dark is loosening. And for this moment, held in warmth and shadow, you can simply rest.